The convoy drifted through the pallid corridor like a line of glowing seeds carried by a slow river. 6 Valesi transport ships, each one shaped like a long curved shell, moved quietly through the emptiest stretch of space between their trade worlds. They carried colonists, medical supplies, seed vaults, and 300 children sleeping in low-gravity cradles. It was supposed to be a boring trip. Most Valesi trips were boring. Their species had not fought a war in 4,000 years, and they liked it that way. Envoy Peluri stood on the bridge of the lead transport, the Gentle Passage, watching the stars slide past the wide observation window. She was tall for a Valesi, which meant she was about the height of a human child. Her skin was pale and slightly see-through, and soft blue light pulsed gently under her surface whenever she breathed. Her bones were hollow. Her fingers were long and thin, like glass rods. She had been born on a low-gravity moon, where the rain fell so slowly you could walk between the drops. She was not built for danger. None of them were. The first sign of trouble was a flicker on the long-range scanner, then another, then 12. "Envoy," said the navigation officer, his voice shaking. "12 ships just dropped out of light speed. They are surrounding us." Peluri felt the cold spread through her chest. She knew those ship shapes. Everyone in this part of the galaxy knew them. Drokon hegemony raiders. Thick, ugly armored vessels, covered in weapons and painted with the marks of how many ships they had destroyed. The Drokon were a reptilian species, twice the size of a Valesi, with scaled skin as hard as metal, and a culture built entirely around conquest and slavery. 12 warships. The convoy had 0. The lead Drokon vessel opened a channel. The face that appeared on the screen was Warlord Get. He was massive, even for a Drokon. His scales were dark green, scarred across the jaw, and his eyes were the color of old rust. He smiled, and the smile was full of teeth that were not meant for chewing food. "Valesi convoy," Get said, his voice rumbling like stones grinding together. "Cut your engines. Surrender your cargo and your passengers. If you cooperate, I will let some of you live. If you do not, I will let none of you live. You have 2 minutes." The channel cut. The bridge went silent. Peluri could hear the hum of the ship's systems and the quiet breathing of her crew, and nothing else. She looked around at their faces. They were afraid. Of course they were afraid. They had no weapons. They had no shields worth mentioning. They had nothing but medical supplies and sleeping children. Scholar Omoth, her elderly mentor, stepped forward from the back of the bridge. He was old and frail, even by Valesi standards, and he leaned on a walking frame that glowed faintly with the same blue light as his skin. He'd spent his entire life studying other species from the safety of a university library. He had never been in danger before. "We cannot fight them," Omoth said quietly. "We cannot outrun them. We must call for help." "From whom?" Peluri asked. "There are no patrol fleets in this corridor. No allied stations within range. We are alone." "Then broadcast wide," Omoth said. "All frequencies. Universal distress markers. Someone may hear." Peluri hesitated. Broadcasting on all frequencies was dangerous. It was like screaming in a dark forest. You did not know what might hear you. There were things in the galaxy that were worse than the Drokan, or so the old story said. Species from heavy worlds, worlds with crushing gravity and poison air and endless storms. Deathworlds, the databases called them. The creatures that survived such places were said to be monsters beyond imagination. But the Drokan were already here, and they were not imaginary. "Do it," Peluri said. "Broadcast on everything, every frequency, every band, every channel. Tell them we are under attack. Tell them we have children on board. Tell them we need help." The communications officer's hands trembled as he worked the console. The signal went out like a shout into the dark. spreading in every direction at the speed of light, and then faster, bouncing off relay stations and subspace beacons, echoing through the empty corridors of space. Most of it would go unheard. Most of it would fade into static and silence. But one thread of that signal, one thin line of desperate noise, crossed an invisible boundary in space. It was not marked on Valesi maps. It was not marked on Droken maps either. But it was marked on every major galactic database with a simple, clear warning in 14 languages. Terran Patrol Zone. Do not enter without authorization. The signal kept going. It reached a relay buoy, which boosted it, and then it reached another, and then it hit the communications array of a ship. The ship was called the Iron Gale. It was a Terran battlecruiser, a long, angular vessel built from dark metal and designed with no beauty in mind at all. It looked like a weapon that someone had attached engines to. It was part of the 7th Terran Expeditionary Fleet, 7 ships currently running a routine patrol through their sector. Specialist G-Soak was sitting at the communications console on the Iron Gale when the signal came in. He was young, with short black hair and tired eyes, and he had been halfway through a cup of cold coffee when his screen lit up with red markers. He put the coffee down. He ran the signal through the translator. Non-human encoding, but the universal distress markers were clear. Under attack. Civilians. Children. He opened a channel to the bridge. Captain Yuna, he said, we have a distress signal. Valesi civilian convoy under attack by Droken raiders. 12 hostile warships. They have children on board. Captain Yuna was already on her feet. She was not tall, but she had the kind of presence that made a room feel smaller when she walked into it. Her eyes were sharp and dark, and they did not blink when she heard the word children. She opened a channel to the fleet commander. Admiral Tejo, she said, we have a situation. There was a pause. Then the admiral's voice came through, calm and steady like deep water. Set course. The 7 ships of the 7th Fleet turned as one, their engines burning bright against the black, and they moved toward the scream in the dark. The Drokon boarded the gentle passage like wolves walking into a house made of paper. Their soldiers were big, armored, and loud. They moved through the corridors in heavy boots, smashing anything that was in their way, and some things that were not. The Valesi crew pressed themselves against the walls and tried to be invisible, which was hard to do when your skin glowed. Warlord Get walked through the ship like he already owned it. He was taller than any 2 Valesi stacked together, and his armored body filled the corridor from side to side. He looked at everything with the slow, satisfied gaze of someone shopping for things he did not intend to pay for. The colonists were herded into the main cargo bay. 300 adults and 300 children, pressed together in a room meant for storing grain. The children were crying. The adults were trying not to. Some of the elderly had already collapsed from the stress, their fragile bodies unable to handle the fear. Peluri found Get on the bridge. She had rehearsed a speech in her head, something about galactic law and the rights of civilians and the consequences of attacking a peaceful convoy. She delivered it with as much authority as she could manage, while standing barely up to the warlord's chest. Get listened to about half of it. Then he backhanded her across the face. It was a casual hit, barely a flick of his massive arm, but Peluri flew sideways and hit the wall hard. She felt something crack in her shoulder. Blue light flickered wildly under her skin as her body screamed in pain. She slid to the floor and could not get up. Olmoth rushed to her side, his old hands shaking as he tried to help her. He looked up at Get with eyes full of fear and something else, something that might have been anger if the Valesi had a word for it. No one is coming for you, Get said, looking down at them with amusement. This corridor is empty. Your species has no military. You have no allies worth anything. You are cargo now. Accept it." He walked away, laughing. Omoth held Pelori against him and whispered, "He is right. No species in this cluster can challenge 12 Drokon warships. We are alone." Pelori closed her eyes. The signal had gone out. She had screamed into the dark, and the dark had said nothing back. Or so she thought. 4 light-years away, and closing fast, 7 ships moved through space with a speed that should not have been possible for vessels of their size. The 7th Terran Expeditionary Fleet was not a large fleet by human standards, 7 ships. But human ships were not like other ships. The Iron Gale led the formation. Behind it came 2 destroyers, a heavy frigate, 2 fast-attack corvettes, and the fleet carrier Steadfast, which held within its belly 48 fighter craft and 12 boarding pods. Every ship was built from materials forged in the fires of a world that actively tried to kill everything living on it. Every ship carried weapons designed by a species that had spent its entire history finding new and creative ways to destroy things. On the bridge of the Iron Gale, Captain Yuna stood at the tactical display and studied the situation. 12 Droken warships, 6 Valesi transports, civilians on board, hostage situation likely. "Lieutenant Dowan," she said, "what do we know about the Valesi?" Dowan pulled up the file on his screen. He was young, barely 25, with a face that still looked like it belonged in a university classroom rather than on a warship. But his mind was fast, and his instincts were sharp, and Yuna had learned to trust both. "The Valesi are a Class 1 species," Dowan read, "evolved on a low-gravity moon with a thin atmosphere. Average adult weight, about 15 kilograms. Hollow bones. Their skin is semi-transparent and bioluminescent. They have no natural weapons, no claws, no venom, no armor. They bruise if you touch them too hard. A firm human handshake could break every bone in their hand." The bridge was quiet for a moment. "So we are rescuing glass birds from a cage full of lizards," said Sergeant Hana from the back of the bridge. She had come up from the marine deck for the briefing. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and built like someone who could carry a small vehicle on her back. Her voice was soft and calm, which somehow made her more frightening rather than less. "That is exactly what we are doing," Yuna said, "and we need to do it without breaking a single glass bird. Hana, your team will board the lead transport once we create an opening. Dowan, you will lead a strike team to the bridge to secure the command systems. Everyone else, standard engagement protocol." "Rules of engagement?" Dowan asked. "The Droken have been warned once by Galactic Treaty about raiding civilian ships," Yuna said. "They ignored it. So the rules are simple. Protect the civilians. Stop the Droken. Use whatever force is necessary." She paused and looked around the bridge at her crew. These were humans. They came from a world where the ground shook and split open, where the sky threw lightning and the seas swallowed cities, where the air itself could poison you, and the animals had spent millions of years evolving better ways to kill each other. They were not the biggest species in the galaxy, they were not the fastest or the strongest, but something about their world had made them stubborn in a way that frightened other species. They did not give up. They did not leave people behind. "The Admiral will handle the fleet engagement," Yuna said. "Our job is the boarding action. Get your teams ready. We arrive in 11 minutes. The crew moved. The ship hummed with purpose. On the Droken flagship, Sub-Commander Tekka stood at his scanner console and watched the 7 unknown contacts approaching at impossible speed. He had run their silhouettes through the identification database 3 times. Each time the result came back the same, flashing red on his screen, with a warning he had never seen before on any ship profile. Class 12 Deathworld origin. Species, human. Threat rating, extreme. Standing order, do not engage. Tekka walked quickly to the command deck, where Get was eating stolen Valesi food and picking his teeth. Warlord, Tekka said, keeping his voice even. 7 ships are approaching. They are human. Get looked up. Human? The Deathworlders? 7 ships against 12. They are either stupid or lost. The database says do not engage, Tekka said carefully. The database was written by cowards, Get said. He waved a massive hand. Let them come. If they want to fight, I will give them one. No soft-skinned species has ever challenged the hegemony and survived. Tekka opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He returned to his console and quietly began calculating the fastest route to the nearest Droken-controlled system, just in case. Admiral Tejo sat in his command chair aboard the fleet carrier Steadfast and opened a wideband channel. His face appeared on every screen in the Droken fleet. He was not a large man. His hair was gray at the edges, and his face was lined with the calm patience of someone who had seen many things and been frightened by very few of them. His voice was quiet and polite, the way a person speaks when they do not need to raise their voice to be heard. You are holding civilians in distress. Release them, and you may leave. You have 10 minutes. The channel closed. Get stared at the blank screen for a moment. Then he laughed so hard, the bridge shook. Tekka did not laugh. Tekka was already strapping into his safety harness. 10 minutes is not a long time. It is long enough to make a cup of tea. It is long enough to write a short letter. It is long enough for a child to fall asleep. But it is also long enough for a warlord to decide that he is not afraid, and for that decision to become the last important one he will ever make. Get spent the 10 minutes eating. He sat on the Valesi captain's chair, which creaked under his enormous weight, and chewed on dried meat from his own supplies, while his officers stood around looking nervous. Tekka watched the clock on his console and counted down the seconds in his head. At 8 minutes, he checked his safety harness again. At 9 minutes, he powered up the secondary escape systems. At 9 minutes and 50 seconds, he braced himself against his console and prayed to whatever Droken god still listened. At 10 minutes and 1 second, the Terran fleet opened fire. The first thing the Droken felt was confusion. Their shields, which were rated to withstand plasma cannons and missile barrages from most galactic species, simply stopped existing. The Terran railguns fired slugs of dense metal at a fraction of the speed of light. The slugs punched through Droken shields like they were not there, because from the perspective of the physics involved, they were barely there. The slugs hit the hulls behind the shields and kept going, passing through one side of a Droken warship and out the other, leaving behind a tunnel of destruction that tore through decks, reactors, and crew compartments. 2 Droken ships died in the first 3 seconds. They did not explode dramatically. They simply came apart, splitting into pieces like fruit dropped from a height, and the pieces drifted away into the dark. The rest of the Droken fleet tried to respond. They fired their weapons at the Terran ships. The plasma bolts crossed the distance between the fleets and hit the Terran armor, and did almost nothing. The Iron Gale's hull glowed orange where the plasma struck it, and then the glow faded, and the ship kept coming. It was like throwing rocks at a mountain. Admiral Tejo watched the battle from the Steadfast's command center, with the expression of a man reading a mildly interesting report. He did not shout orders. He did not need to. His captains knew their jobs. The fleet moved like a single animal, each ship covering the others, each weapon firing in sequence, so that the Drokon never had a moment to recover. 3 more Drokon ships were crippled within 90 seconds. One lost its engines to a torpedo swarm. Dozens of small, smart missiles that worked together like a pack of hunting animals, each one finding a weak point and hitting it at the same time. Another was cut in half by a directed energy lance, a beam of focused light so intense that it melted through armor plating like a hot wire through ice. The third was disabled when 2 Terran corvettes flew past it at impossible speed, raking its weapon systems with close-range fire, and were gone before the Drokon gunners could even turn their turrets. Get stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his fleet die on the tactical display. Each ship that vanished was replaced by an empty marker and a notification that simply said contact lost. 5 ships gone or crippled in less than 2 minutes. He had never seen anything like it. No one in the Drokon hegemony had ever seen anything like it. These were not ships fighting ships. This was something else entirely. All ships fall back, Get roared. Form around the Velesi transports. Use them as cover. It was the move of a coward and a bully, and it was exactly the move Tejo had expected. The remaining Drokan ships pulled back and positioned themselves around the 6 Velesi transports, using the civilian ships as shields. If the Terrans kept firing, they would hit the very people they were trying to save. The Terran fleet stopped firing. The guns went quiet. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and the distant glow of burning Drokan wreckage. Aboard the Gentle Passage, the Velesi hostages were thrown to the floor when the ship shuddered from the shockwaves of nearby explosions. The lights flickered, the walls groaned, children screamed, and adults held them close and covered their ears. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody could see outside. Omoth had found a damaged sensor terminal near the cargo bay. It was cracked and half broken, but it still had a partial connection to the ship's external cameras. He worked at it with his thin, trembling fingers until a blurry image appeared on the screen. Or what was left of it. Broken ships drifted in the void, leaking fire and atmosphere. And beyond them, moving slowly and steadily through the wreckage, were shapes he did not recognize. Dark, angular ships, with no curves and no beauty, built for a single purpose. Someone answered the signal, Omoth whispered. His blue glow dimmed with shock. But what are they? What species builds ships like that? Nobody answered him, because nobody knew. On the bridge of the Gentle Passage, Get grabbed Pilori by her injured arm and dragged her to the communications console. She cried out in pain, but he did not care. He shoved her in front of the camera and opened a channel to the Terran fleet. Terran commander, Get snarled, holding Pilori up like a trophy. I have 6 ships full of these creatures. If you fire another shot, I will open every airlock on every ship and let them breathe vacuum. Do you understand me? Stand down, or they all die. On the other end, Admiral Tejo looked at the screen. He saw the Velesi diplomat, small and broken and glowing faintly with pain, held up by a creature 5 times her size. He saw the fear in her eyes. He saw the blood on her face. His expression did not change, not because he did not care, but because he had already decided what was going to happen next. He had decided it the moment Gsok first played the distress signal on the Iron Gale's bridge. Everything since then had been the plan unfolding. He muted the channel and turned to his communications officer. Get me Captain Yuna. Yuna's face appeared on the screen. She was already in her tactical gear, her hair pulled back tight, her eyes sharp and focused. Behind her, the boarding pod bay was full of Marines, checking weapons and sealing armor. Captain, Tejo said, board that ship. Bring everyone home. It was the kind of smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with what was about to happen to the Drokon soldiers on that transport. Already moving, Admiral, she said. The Iron Gale swung around and closed the distance to the Gentle Passage. It moved slowly now, carefully, slipping between the Drokon ships like a knife sliding between ribs. The Drokon fired at it. The shots hit and did nothing meaningful. The Iron Gale did not fire back. It did not need to. It just needed to get close enough. The boarding pod bay doors opened. 12 pods launched, each one carrying 4 Marines in full combat armor. The pods were small, fast, and armored enough to survive a direct hit from a Drokon cannon. They crossed the gap between the ships in seconds and hit the hull of the Gentle Passage like a dozen metal fists punching through a wall. In Pod 7, Sergeant Hana felt the impact shake through her body. The pod's cutting ring burned through the Velesi transport's hull in 3 seconds, and the hatch blew open. Hot air and smoke rushed in. Somewhere ahead, she could hear Drokon voices shouting in alarm. Hana checked her rifle, a magnetic accelerator weapon that fired tungsten rounds at 3 times the speed of sound. She checked her sidearm. She checked her knife, because humans always carried knives, a habit left over from 1,000,000 years of evolution on a world where something was always trying to eat you. She looked at her team. 3 Marines, armored, armed, and ready. Civilians are the priority, she said. Do not let a single Velesi get hurt. Everything else is a target. She stepped through the hatch and into the smoke, and the Drokon had no idea what was coming for them. The first Drokan guard heard the footsteps before he saw anything. Heavy, steady footsteps, nothing like the soft patter of Velesi feet. He raised his plasma rifle and aimed down the corridor. The smoke from the breached hull was thick and gray, and the emergency lights cast everything in a dull red glow. A shape appeared in the smoke. It was shorter than a Drokan, but wider in the shoulders, and it moved with a speed that made no sense for something wearing that much armor. The Drokan guard fired. The plasma bolt hit the shape in the chest and splashed across the dark metal plating like water hitting a rock. The shape did not slow down. Sergeant Hana closed the distance in 3 strides. She hit the Drokan with the stock of her rifle so hard that his helmet cracked and he flew backward into the wall. He slid to the floor and did not get up. She stepped over him and kept moving. Behind her, 3 Marines fanned out into the corridor. They moved in silence, communicating with hand signals that they had practiced 10,000 times. Every doorway was checked. Every corner was cleared. They moved through the Velesi transport like ghosts made of metal and bad intentions. The Drokon had posted guards throughout the ship, mostly at the cargo bays where the hostages were held, and at the bridge where Get was making his stand. They were big soldiers, trained for combat, armed with military-grade weapons. On any normal day, against any normal enemy, they would have been terrifying. This was not a normal day. The humans came through the corridors like a flood through a tunnel. They were faster than the Drokon expected. They were quieter than the Drokon expected. And they were so much harder to kill than the Drokon expected that it broke something in the minds of the soldiers who faced them. A Drokon sergeant fired 3 plasma bolts into a Marine's shoulder. The armor melted, and the skin underneath burned, and the Marine stumbled and grunted in pain. Then the Marine straightened up, switched his rifle to his other hand, and shot the Drokan sergeant twice in the chest. The Drokan went down. The Marine kept moving, his burned shoulder smoking, his face tight with pain, but his eyes completely focused. Another Drokan saw this happen from 20 meters away. He watched a creature take a wound that should have ended a fight, shrug it off like it was an insect bite, and keep coming. The Drokan dropped his weapon and ran. He did not know where he was running to. He just knew he needed to be somewhere else, anywhere that did not have humans in it. The panic spread. The Drokan were not cowards by nature. They were a warrior species, raised from birth to fight and conquer. But they had been raised to fight things that made sense, things that followed the rules of biology as they understood them. You hit something hard enough, it goes down. You burn something badly enough, it stops. These rules did not seem to apply to the creatures coming through the smoke. Hana's team reached the main cargo bay in 4 minutes. There were 6 Drokon guards outside the door, heavily armed, dug into a defensive position behind makeshift barriers. They opened fire the moment they saw the humans coming. Hana dove behind a support beam. Plasma fires scorched the air around her. She peeked out, counted the guards, noted their positions, and pulled a small device from her belt. It was a flashbang grenade, designed to produce a burst of light and sound intense enough to stun most species. She had adjusted the settings lower than normal, because the Velesi were on the other side of that door, and their senses were far more delicate than human ones. She threw the grenade. It bounced once, rolled between the Drokon guards, and went off with a sharp crack and a blinding flash. The Drokons stumbled, their eyes watering, their hearing ringing. Hana and her team came through the smoke like arrows. 6 guards went down in 4 seconds. Not dead. Hana had aimed for joints and weapon hands. Alive, disarmed, and no longer a problem. She stood in front of the cargo bay door. On the other side were 300 Velesi adults and 300 children. She could hear them through the metal, crying, whimpering, praying in a language she did not fully understand. She took a breath, then she blew the door. The metal buckled inward and fell with a crash that echoed through the bay. Smoke poured through the opening, and standing in the middle of that smoke, lit from behind by the red emergency lights, was Sergeant Hana. She was 2 meters tall in her armor. Her suit was scorched and dented and smeared with blue Drokon blood. Her rifle was still hot from firing. Her visor was up, showing a human face with dark eyes and a jaw set tight. She looked, to the Velesi, like something out of their oldest and most terrible stories. A Deathworlder. A creature from a world of poison and violence, and gravity that crushed bones. The Velesi screamed. Every single one of them screamed. The children screamed loudest. The adults pulled the children behind them and pressed against the far wall, their skin flashing with panicked light, their thin bodies trembling so hard that some of them could not stand. They had never seen a human before. They had only read about them in warning files and horror stories. And now one was standing in their doorway, covered in blood. Hana stopped. She looked at the room full of terrified, glowing, impossibly fragile creatures, and something shifted in her face. The soldier faded. Something softer came forward. She slung her rifle onto her back, slowly, making sure they could see her, putting the weapon away. She held up her empty hands, palms forward, the universal gesture for, "I am not a threat." Then, she lowered herself to one knee, slowly, carefully, like someone kneeling beside a bird with a broken wing. She spoke in Velesi trade language. Her pronunciation was rough and her grammar was imperfect, because she had only been studying it for the 11 minutes it took the fleet to arrive. But the words were clear enough. "Safe now. We are here to help. I will not hurt you." The room was still. The screaming had stopped. 300 adults stared at the kneeling giant in the doorway, and none of them moved. Then a child stepped forward, a tiny Velesi girl, barely half a meter tall, with skin that glowed a soft, frightened pink. She walked toward Hana with the unsteady steps of someone who was too young to know that she should be afraid. The child reached Hana and looked up at her with wide, dark eyes. Then she reached out and touched Hana's armored hand. Hana held perfectly still. She did not breathe. She did not move a single muscle. Because she knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who had studied the briefing file, that if she closed her fingers even slightly, she could crush every bone in this child's arm. Her hand, which could bend steel and break a Drokon's jaw, stayed open and motionless like a statue. The child patted her hand twice. Then she looked back at her mother and said something in Velesi that Hana's translator rendered as, "Mama, the big one is warm." Something broke in the room. Not a bad break, the kind of break that happens when fear cracks open and something else comes through. A few adults lowered their arms. A few more stopped trembling. One elderly Velesi began to cry, not from fear, but from relief. Peluri watched from across the bay, holding her broken shoulder, blood drying on her face. She watched, the human soldier kneeling on the floor, holding her entire body still, with an effort that was visible in the tension of her neck and the careful steadiness of her breathing, while a child touched her hand like she was petting a sleeping animal. Piluri began to understand something that the galactic databases had gotten wrong. The files said humans were dangerous. The files said they came from a death world. The files were correct. But the files missed the most important part. They were not just strong. They were strong, and they chose to be gentle. And that choice, made every second, with every held breath, and every still finger, was the hardest and most remarkable thing Piluri had ever seen. 3 decks above, Lieutenant Dowan and his strike team reached the bridge. Get saw them coming on the security feed and lunged for the emergency venting console, the one that would open every airlock on the ship and kill every Valesi on board. Dowan shot the console first. It exploded in a shower of sparks. Then he shot the weapon out of Get's hand. Then he crossed the bridge in 3 steps and pinned the warlord against the wall with one arm. Get was twice Dowan's weight. He was a Drokon warlord, bred and trained for physical combat. He pushed against the human with everything he had, and the human did not move. It was like pushing against the hull of a ship. Dowan looked at him with calm, unimpressed eyes. "You are done," he said simply. On the other side of the bridge, Sub-Commander Tekka set down his sidearm, placed his hands on his console, and surrendered without being asked. He was the only Drokon officer on the ship, smart enough to have seen this coming. As Marines escorted him past Dowan, Tekka paused. He looked at the young human who was holding his warlord against a wall like a parent holding a misbehaving child. "What is your world like?" Tekka asked quietly. "That it made things like you?" Dowan thought about it for a moment. He thought about the mountains and the oceans and the forests and the cities. He thought about the storms that shook the ground and the sunsets that turned the sky into fire. He thought about the animals that hunted and the animals that played, and the strange, stubborn species that had somehow become the caretaker of all of it. "Beautiful, actually," he said. The fighting was over in less than 20 minutes, from the first shot to the last surrendering Drokan soldier dropping his weapon on the floor. 20 minutes to destroy a fleet, board a ship, rescue 600 hostages, and capture a warlord. The Valesi had been held captive for 3 hours. The humans had ended it in 20 minutes. But what came after the fighting was what the galaxy would remember. The Valesi survivors were moved from the damaged Gentle Passage to the Terran fleet carrier Steadfast. This was not a simple task. You could not just carry a Valesi the way you would carry a human. Their bones were hollow, their joints were fragile, their lungs worked best in low pressure. Picking one up wrong could break their ribs. Walking too fast near one could create an air current strong enough to knock a child off their feet. The humans knew all of this. The Steadfast's medical team had been preparing since the fleet first changed course, nearly 30 minutes before the first shot was fired. They had converted 2 cargo bays into low-gravity medical wards. They had adjusted the air pressure to match Valesi's standard atmosphere. They had lowered the lighting, because Valesi eyes were sensitive to the bright, harsh lights that humans preferred. They had even changed the temperature, cooling the rooms to the mild chill of a Valesi moon, even though it meant the human medics would have to work in conditions that made their fingers stiff and their breath visible. They had done all of this before they even knew if the rescue would succeed. Omoth was one of the first to be brought aboard. He was old, and the stress had not been kind to his already failing body. 2 human medics carried him on a stretcher that floated on a low-gravity field, so smooth that he barely felt the movement. They placed him in a bed that had been adjusted to support his light frame, without putting pressure on his hollow bones. A human doctor examined him with instruments so precise that they could measure the thickness of his skin without touching it. She spoke to him in careful, slow Valesi trade language, explaining everything she was doing before she did it. Her hands were steady and unbelievably gentle, moving around his body with the kind of care that suggested she was fully aware that a careless touch could cause a fracture. Omoth lay there and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what was happening. He had spent 60 years studying other species. He had read about Deathworlders in academic texts that described them the way one might describe a natural disaster, as forces of destruction, things to be avoided and feared. His students had written papers about why Deathworld species were the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, citing their dense bones, their powerful muscles, their immune systems that could fight off diseases that would kill other species in hours. None of those papers had mentioned this. None of them had described a Deathworlder adjusting the air pressure in a room so that an old man's lungs would not struggle. None of them had described a human doctor handling a patient with the precision of someone restoring a painting that was 1,000 years old. Omoth began to cry. The tears were thin and clear and glowed faintly blue as they ran down his translucent cheeks. The doctor noticed immediately. She stopped her examination and leaned closer, concern on her face. "Are you in pain?" she asked. "No," Omoth said. "I am in the wrong. I have been in the wrong for 60 years. She did not understand what he meant, but she stayed beside him until his tears stopped, because that is what humans did. They stayed. Piluri was treated in a separate ward. Her shoulder was broken in 2 places, and she had internal bruising along her left side from where Get had struck her. A human surgeon operated on her using microtools so small that they were controlled by computer. Because human fingers, though capable of extraordinary gentleness, were still too large to work safely inside a Valesi body. When she woke from the procedure, Admiral Tejo was sitting in a chair beside her bed. The chair was far too small for the room's low-gravity setting, and he looked slightly uncomfortable, but he sat in it anyway without complaint. He had a cup of something warm in his hands, and he was waiting patiently, the way someone waits for a friend to wake up from a nap. Piluri looked at him for a long time. He was not what she had expected. He was not large or frightening. He was an older man, with kind eyes and gray hair, sitting in a chair that was too small, drinking something that smelled like roasted plants. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse. "Why did you come?" Tejo considered the question. He took a sip from his cup. "We were not allies," Piluri continued. "We are not trade partners. We have nothing to offer the Terran fleet. We are a small species in an unimportant corridor. You had no reason to risk your ships and your soldiers for us." Tejo set his cup down. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way she was not used to seeing from powerful people. "You called for help," he said. "We were close enough to hear." Piluri waited for the rest, the strategic justification, the political calculation, the demand for repayment or alliance, or access to Valesi trade routes. It did not come. "That is it?" she asked. "That is it." She was quiet for a long time. Outside the viewport, the stars moved slowly past, and the dark shapes of the Terran fleet drifted alongside the Valesi transports, like a pack of wolves walking beside a flock of birds, not hunting, just watching, just making sure nothing else came close. "My people have a saying," Piluri said at last. "Fear the silence, for nothing answers." She paused. "I think we need a new saying." Tejo almost smiled. What would it be? Piluri thought about it, about the signal she had sent into the void, about the dark angular ships that had come out of nowhere, about the soldier who knelt on the floor and held her breath so a child could touch her hand, about the doctor who adjusted the air so an old man could breathe, about the admiral who sat in a chair that was too small because he wanted to be there when she woke up. "Be brave enough to call," she said. "You never know who is listening." The story spread. It moved through the galactic communication networks like fire through dry grass. A minor, unaligned species had sent a distress call into the void. A Deathworlder fleet, human, had answered within minutes. They had destroyed a raiding force of 12 warships with 7 ships and had not lost a single vessel. They had boarded a hostage ship and rescued every civilian. 600 Valesi, including 300 children. Not one Valesi casualty. Not one. Species across the galaxy read the reports and then read them again. Some were frightened. Some were amazed. Some were both. Diplomats who had ignored humanity's requests for meetings suddenly found openings in their schedules. Trade delegations that had been stalled for years were suddenly fast-tracked. And in the quiet corners of galactic intelligence agencies, analysts pulled up their files on Earth and began rewriting them. The old threat assessment had been simple. Deathworld origin, high gravity, toxic atmosphere, extreme biodiversity, apex predator species. Threat rating, extreme. Recommended action, avoid contact. Someone, an anonymous analyst whose name was never recorded, added a handwritten note in the margin of the updated file. It read, Threat rating, extreme. Disposition, they will fight anything, for anyone, if you ask. Below that, in smaller writing, someone else added, they will also make sure the air pressure is right for your lungs afterward. Sub-Commander Tekka, now a prisoner aboard the Steadfast, sat in a holding cell that was cleaner and more comfortable than his own quarters on the Droken flagship had been. He had been given food, water, medical treatment for a minor wound, and a blanket. No one had threatened him. A human guard had even asked if the temperature was acceptable. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared out the small viewport at the Terran fleet moving silently through the stars. He thought about the signal, the random, desperate, wideband distress call that a frightened Valesi diplomat had thrown into the dark because she had no other choice. Of all the frequencies in the galaxy, of all the empty corridors and dead zones and silent stretches of nothing, that signal had landed on the doorstep of the one species in the galaxy that would hear a stranger screaming and run toward the sound. Tekka shook his head slowly and muttered to himself in the quiet of his cell. Of all the frequencies, why did it have to be theirs? Somewhere on the Steadfast, in the low-gravity medical ward, a tiny Valesi girl with glowing pink skin was sitting on Sergeant Hana's lap. Hana sat perfectly still on the floor, her legs crossed, her massive armored body motionless, while the child braided a piece of string into Hana's short hair. The child was talking in rapid Valesi, too fast for Hana's translator to keep up, and Hana was nodding along anyway, smiling a small, careful smile that she kept gentle enough not to frighten anyone. The child's mother stood nearby, watching. She had been afraid of the human at first. She had been afraid of everything. But her daughter had walked up to the monster in the doorway and touched its hand, and the monster had held still and whispered that they were safe. She was still afraid, a little. But she was also beginning to think that the universe was stranger and kinder than she had been taught, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the dark was also the thing that would carry you home. The fleet moved on through the stars, and the silence around them was not empty anymore.